Good morning, everyone. Shivani Gupta here. Our topic for this week is diversity and inclusion. It's a topic that's starting to get a lot more traction over the last few years. Organisations are certainly looking at ways to measure it better. Individuals are talking about it more, but there's so much more to be done in there. I think the first thing is, really speaking about what does diversity and inclusion mean? And so it's been, diversity in the way that it's defined is really the presence of differences within a given setting. I guess what that means in the workplace is that it can be the diversity in race, it can be ethnicity, it can be gender. Often when I'm speaking to people, the first thing that comes up is that we're often talking about men and women in the gender part of it. It's a really important thing, but the conversation here is the fact that diversity is about a diversity in thinking. What brings a diversity in thinking? There's a lot of things around making sure that people with different backgrounds, different experiences are able to come into that. There's also a lot of research. Probably one of the best reports that I've read was by McKinsey in May 2020, so just over a year ago, that do an analysis every few years on diversity and inclusion. And they found that the companies in the top quartile for the gender diversity on executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability. So, a quarter of them. And that was up from 21% in 2017, and it was 15% in 2014. So that number keeps rising around the fact that diverse teams perform better, and there's absolute evidence that they also produce better results, better financial results, and there's other ways that we can't reach that. They become enriched around emotional results as well. So it's really important to be able to, look at that and happen. Now, my personal experience was diversity was not something when I was growing up was an issue or anybody spoke about. And I know that, A, I'm female, B, I'm brown. And so I certainly fit into that category. And I noticed that particularly when I started working as an engineer, the workplace was not very diverse. There was some diversity from a ethnicity perspective where I was working. There was a number of people that were from Italian and Greek backgrounds. But all in all, it was fairly Anglo-Saxon, and there was very little diversity around gender. In fact, I was the only female working in the department when I first started working there. I also was recently speaking to a high school where they're trying to encourage more girls to go into STEM, and which is a really important thing, that girls at a very early age know that they have that equality and they can do that. And again, they're finding that a lot of the percentages of girls drop off, or if they're in those STEM roles and they've graduated on those and they're working in those, they certainly then drop off, certainly around senior leadership. And that question of that triangle where there's more and more leading up to leaders, there are starting to be some organisations that are putting a lot of concerted effort into it, but there's also many, many that aren't. So the second question becomes, what does this mean? How do we measure it? What are some of the companies doing around doing that? So from a diversity, let's talk about diversity and inclusion separately. And some organisations are just saying, let's just talk about inclusion. That includes diversity. But I just want to break that up today around how do you measure diversity? What are some of the really great measures around it? And I also then just want to talk about how do you potentially measure inclusion in your workplace. So one way of measuring diversity is looking at what percentage of your workforce is male, and what workforce is female. And a lot of organisations now looking at other genders, which is fantastic, so that we are, again, being inclusive for people that have different backgrounds as well. So, taking care of other genders is also really important. Some organisations are reporting on different types of genders, but from a diversity perspective, you want to make sure that you're measuring what percentage fit into different genders. The second measure often is how many different ethnicities are represented at your company. So to look at the background of people, to be able to measure that and say that. I know that, for example, the kids, a school that we go to, talk about the fact that there are 75 different ethnicities at this school. And having, my husband who's originally from New Zealand and I'm originally from India, having our children who have got different coloured skin, to be able to fit into a school and make sure that it was a multicultural school. It was aware of a lot of different ethnicities, was a really important factor for us in deciding which school our kids would go to. So it comes in really handy as a marketing tool as well, but you want to measure that in your business so you actually know where you're sitting and what you might be able to do. The other thing around diversity is to really look at the number of females that you may have in leadership positions. And again, you might want to measure that with different genders, but outside of the male gender, what are the other positions in leadership positions, and what sort of percentage of people do you have from different genders around that? And also, how diverse is your executive team? As I spoke about in the McKinsey report, it's a pretty important thing to measure. And we know that when we measure that and we have diverse executive teams and diverse organisations, that they perform better. So it's actually a really important part of the business doing really well as well. Once you establish a baseline, one of the things that you want to do is then you want to actually measure how your employees currently feel about the diversity that they have. So one thing is putting the actions in place, and the next thing is that you want to measure. This may be linked into your employment satisfaction survey, or some sort of a survey that you do within your business already, and putting the diversity and inclusion as an additional component. And you might want to put questions like, do you feel that the leadership team in your company is committed to diversity? And they could give you a rating or give you a one word or whatever way you want to measure it. You could also ask them to rank, maybe 1 out of 10, 10 being outstanding, 1 being really poor, what your current status of diversity is, and what number would you give to us the way that you see it from your perspective. That also helps work on the perceptions of what your employees believe. The other one might be that, do you feel that you've had adequate unbiased racism training? And so there's a lot of that unconscious bias that happens. And again, we've been speaking about this topic for a long time. And in organisations, you want to be able to see, do they feel like that they've actually had some training around it? I was hosting a panel about 3 years ago on unconscious bias. And people spoke about genders, and they spoke about racism, and they spoke about the fact that the people that had the training and the organisations that were doing work in that area really progressed a lot more. Also, just seeing on a day-to-day meetings perspective as well. And the other question that you might want to ask is, look, if we were setting some sort of a subgroup or a committee or a council for diversity, would you want to be involved in it? So that also, some people say, look, I want to see the change, but I don't want to be involved in it. And some people are really, really passionate about it. So the more employees that you can engage in there, it comes in really handy. So one of the things you want to do is just work out how you want to measure it as an executive team. Come up with some of the numbers, but then you also want to be able to measure what people think about that, and then build that into your strategies and execution in terms of what you do. Now let's talk a little bit about inclusion. Inclusion's a little bit sometimes trickier, and some people say it's really easy, but for me, I needed to get my head around that. I think it's a little bit tricky to measure, because the metrics that we need to collect from the survey are the results, and we also then get the demographics. So one of the things, again, the best thing that you want to do to measure that inclusion is to do a survey and to be asked how would they rate inclusion in your company. Now let's ask for a few examples that I've come across seeing clients and businesses do this really well. So one of the questions could be, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being really poor, 10 being really fantastic, is, do I feel like I belong in your company? So an inclusive, do I feel included? And do I feel like I belong? Now, sometimes you can get wonderful values of organisations, but measuring that individually, you will get an overview in terms of whether people actually feel like that they belong in your culture. So one thing is creating a great culture, but do they feel like that they belong? The other thing that you could do is that you could ask them either a true or false or a rating around the fact that do you feel like your voice matters at your company? So that means that they will look at inclusion in their little teams, in meetings, in different ways that they interact with the company. Do they actually feel that their voice matters? And again, like I said, true or false or a rating. The other couple of questions that might be worthwhile doing is, I feel that my company does a really good job at creating or trying to create an inclusive workplace for everybody. Again, true or false or a rating out of 10. And the other question might be, what are some of the things that the company, the business that you work in, could do to make me feel more at home? And again, you could ask them for 3 words or 3 sentences and design your survey in a way that you collect that data and take that data and convert that into wisdom so that you could work out how you could actually make that happen as well. So it's really important to be able to look at those two areas. Would I, one of the questions that was emailed to me is, would I measure them at the same time? I would, so you've got the baseline at the same time. How often would I measure that? I would, again, probably link that into your employment survey that you've already got. If not, then probably around once a year, a maximum once every 2 years. And the key thing is organisations, I know lots of organisations that do amazing employment surveys, and then they do nothing with it. Or if they've done something with it, they don't communicate very well to the people to say, when we did this survey, here are the top 3 actions that have come out of it. Here is what we're doing in these particular quarters around getting better at that. We might not get perfect at it, but we're doing better at that. And then communicating that through the leadership team into the business around what it is that they can create. If you've got any other questions, please feel free to put them onto this particular broadcast, and I'm happy to answer them. The other question that I just wanted to bring up is, if you're not doing any of those measures, how important is it? So diversity and inclusion will become more and more important. It's absolutely starting to become part of our culture. People are speaking about it. Certainly in the speaking industry, there are more speakers speaking about diversity and inclusion, because we know the success will not just come from running a great operational ship or strategic ship, that we need to be speaking about this, we need to be measuring it, and we need to be actioning it to be able to move into that. Well, if there are no other questions, if you've got questions, or if you'd like me to send you some templates, I've also written a blog this week about it. And we also had the wonderful Jen Dalitz this week on our podcast, speaking about inclusion and speaking about inclusion of the whole self. For me, I just wanted to finish off saying that from a diversity perspective, I know exactly where I fit in. From an inclusion perspective, despite spending, over 3 decades in Australia, there are still some times that I don't feel included. And I'm sure that you are the same when you really look at where do you feel included and where do you feel excluded. And so inclusion becomes not just in the workplace, it's a really important thing where we are creating cultures, organisations, schools, societies and communities that people feel that they connect and they belong and that they are welcome wherever they go. I hope you have a fantastic Friday and a great weekend, and I look forward to any commentary from you as well. Bye for now.